The crack of gunfire echoed across the auction block, silencing the crowd of dusty onlookers just as Wilhelmina Vance's fate hung in the balance. She stood with trembling knees beside Bessie, her only cow, her last living possession besides the tattered dress on her back and the wedding band she refused to sell. Arizona Territory, 1879, a merciless time and place for a widow of 32 with no family to speak of. $5 for the cow, shouted the auctioneer, his voice carrying over the crowd gathered in Georgetown's town square. Who'll give me $5 for this fine milk cow? Wilhelmina's eyes burned with unshed tears. Just 3 months ago, she'd been the wife of Daniel Vance, a hard-working homesteader with dreams bigger than the Arizona sky. Now, with her husband 6 feet under, killed by the fever that swept through their small ranch, she faced debts she couldn't pay and a future bleaker than the desert in drought. $7, called a voice from the back. $7 for the cow, the auctioneer repeated. But don't forget, folks, we've also got the widow's contract up for bid. 6 months of labor to the highest bidder. Debts must be settled, after all. Wilhelmina flinched. The indignity of being auctioned off like property stung worse than the merciless sun beating down on her uncovered head. She'd lost her bonnet weeks ago and hadn't the means to replace it. Her once auburn hair had faded to a dull copper, and new lines had formed around her eyes, testament to nights spent weeping instead of sleeping. $10 for the cow, called another voice, and $15 for the widow's contract. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Wilhelmina recognized the bidder as Horace Miller, owner of the local saloon. The thought of working for him sent a chill down her spine despite the blistering heat. $20 for the cow, came a new voice, deep and steady, and $50 for the widow. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, revealing a tall figure at the back. He stepped forward, spurs jingling with each deliberate footfall. Dust coated his worn leather boots and denim trousers. His face remained shadowed beneath the brim of a black Stetson, but Wilhelmina caught a glimpse of a strong jaw darkened by stubble. $50. The auctioneer's eyebrows shot up. I have $50 for 6 months of the widow's labor. Do I hear 60? Silence fell. Even Miller wouldn't go higher. The auctioneer's gavel came down with a crack that sealed Wilhelmina's fate. Sold. The cow and the widow's contract to the gentleman in the back. The stranger approached the auction block, reaching into his vest pocket to produce a leather pouch. He counted out the money, $70 in total, and handed it to the auctioneer. Only then did he lift his face to Wilhelmina. She found herself staring into eyes the color of a summer storm, set in a face weathered by sun and wind. He wasn't handsome in the conventional sense. His nose had been broken at least once, and a thin scar traced his right cheekbone, but something in his expression made her breath catch. Name's Kieran Walsh, he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. You'll be coming with me to my ranch outside town, he gestured to Bessie. The cow too. Then, as if sensing her fear, he added, You'll never go hungry at my table, madam, that I promise you. The auctioneer thrust papers at him. Sign here, Walsh, 6 months of labor starting today. As Kieran Walsh signed the contract that now bound her to him, Wilhelmina fought back tears of humiliation. She'd gone from being a respected homesteader's wife to being sold alongside her cow in the matter of a heartbeat. Come along, Mrs. Vance, Walsh said, taking Bessie's lead rope in one hand and offering his other arm to Wilhelmina. My wagon's this way. She hesitated, then placed her trembling fingers on his forearm. What choice did she have? How do you know my name? A hint of a smile touched his lips. Everyone knows everyone's business in Georgetown. I've known about you since your husband passed. I'm sorry for your loss. The sincerity in his voice surprised her. As he led her through the dispersing crowd, she felt the weight of curious stares. Some women looked at her with pity, others with disdain, as if poverty were a contagious disease they feared catching. Walsh's wagon waited at the edge of town, a sturdy buckboard with 2 strong horses in the traces. He helped her onto the seat with unexpected gentleness before loading Bessie into the back. "It's about an hour's ride to my place," he said, climbing up beside her. "Silver Creek Ranch, ever heard of it?" She shook her head. "I rarely left our homestead. Daniel handled the trading in town." Walsh clicked his tongue, and the horses set off down the dusty road leading out of Georgetown. "I've got about 100 head of cattle and some decent grazing land. Creek runs through the property, hence the name." Wilhelmina stared straight ahead, her hands folded in her lap. "What will be expected of me, Mr. Walsh?" Her voice sounded hollow even to her own ears. "Cooking, mostly, some cleaning. I've got 2 ranch hands who live in the bunkhouse, but they're useless in a kitchen." He glanced at her. "I don't expect anything improper if that's your concern." Relief washed through her, though she remained wary. Men's promises often evaporated like morning dew under the harsh Arizona sun. "And Bessie? Your cow, she'll join my small dairy herd, 3 cows that keep us in milk and butter." He adjusted his hat. "You can continue to think of her as yours." "I didn't buy her to take her from you." Confusion furrowed Wilhelmina's brow. "Then why did you buy her, and me?" Walsh was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, he said, "Everyone deserves a chance, Mrs. Vance. The fever took my wife 5 years ago." "I know something about being alone." The road wound through saguaro-dotted landscape, climbing gradually into rolling hills spotted with juniper and scrub oak. Eventually, they crested a rise and Walsh pulled the horses to a stop. "There it is," he said. "Silver Creek Ranch." Below them stretched a surprisingly verdant valley. A whitewashed ranch house stood at its center, surrounded by outbuildings. A creek more substantial than the usual dry arroyos cut through the property, its banks lined with cottonwoods. Cattle grazed in fenced pastures, and a small garden plot showed green against the tawny landscape. "It's beautiful," Wilhelmina admitted. Walsh nodded. "Took 10 years of hard work. Still needs plenty doing, but it's home." As they approached, 2 men emerged from one of the outbuildings. One was older, perhaps 50, with a salt and pepper beard. The other was younger, barely into his 20s. "Mrs. Vance, meet Frank Donnelly and Thomas Cooper. They help run this place." Walsh jumped down from the wagon. "Boys, this is Mrs. Wilhelmina Vance. She'll be handling the cooking and keeping house for a while." The men touched the brims of their hats respectfully. "Pleased to meet you, madam," said the older one, Frank. "Boss said you'd be joining us. Hope you don't mind bachelor quarters. We try to keep it clean, but—" "I'm sure it's fine," Wilhelmina said, though her heart sank at the thought of what bachelor quarters might entail. Walsh helped her down from the wagon, then instructed Thomas to take Bessie to the small barn where the dairy cows were kept. "Show her where everything is, Frank," he said. "I need to check on that fence in the north pasture." As Walsh rode off on one of the wagon horses, Frank escorted Wilhelmina to the ranch house. To her surprise, the interior was relatively neat, if sparse. A main room served as kitchen and dining area with a stone fireplace at one end. A corridor led to what she assumed were bedrooms. "Boss has the room at the end of the hall," Frank explained. "Fixed up the small one next to it for you. He and Thomas moved your things in this morning." "My things?" Wilhelmina's eyebrows shot up. Frank nodded. "Boss rode into town early, paid off the men who were clearing out your homestead. Brought back what he could fit in the wagon." Stunned, Wilhelmina followed Frank to the small bedroom. There, stacked neatly against one wall, were her trunk, her rocking chair, and several crates containing household items she'd resigned herself to never seeing again. "Why would he do that?" she whispered. Frank shrugged. "Boss has his ways, doesn't talk much, but he's fair. Anyway, kitchen's stocked. Supper's usually at sundown. Anything else you need to know?" Wilhelmina shook her head, still struggling to comprehend the unexpected kindness. When Frank left, she sank onto the narrow bed, overcome with emotions she couldn't name. After months of nothing but loss and humiliation, this small gesture of consideration felt overwhelming. She allowed herself 5 minutes to compose herself before she began unpacking. By the time she heard the men returning, She had familiarized herself with the kitchen and started preparing a simple supper of beans, cornbread, and salt pork. Walsh entered last, removing his hat as he crossed the threshold. He paused when he saw her at the stove, something unreadable crossing his features. "Smells good," he said finally. "Been a while since there was a woman's cooking in this house." Wilhelmina nodded, uncertain how to respond to the compliment if it was one. "Thank you for retrieving my belongings, Mr. Walsh. You didn't have to do that." "No need for thanks. Those vultures had no right to your things." He hung his hat on a peg by the door. "And it's Kieran. Mr. Walsh was my father." That first evening established a pattern that would hold in the days to come. The men would work from dawn till dusk, while Wilhelmina kept house, tended the garden, and prepared meals. To her surprise, her duties weren't unreasonable, certainly no more demanding than running her own homestead had been. Walsh Kieran remained something of a mystery. He was unfailingly polite, but kept his distance. Sometimes she'd catch him watching her with that same unreadable expression she'd noticed the first night. Other times, especially in the evenings when they all sat around the fire, she'd glimpse flashes of humor or insight that suggested depths to the man beyond the taciturn rancher. 2 weeks after her arrival, Wilhelmina was hanging laundry when she noticed Kieran approaching from the barn. He carried something bulky wrapped in burlap. "Mrs. Vance," he called. "Got a minute?" She secured a sheet to the line. "Of course." He set the burlap bundle on a nearby stump and carefully unwrapped it, revealing a weathered but well-made saddle, a woman's side saddle. "Found this in the storage shed," he said. "Belonged to my late wife. Thought you might use it. Frank says you visit your cow every day." Wilhelmina touched the saddle, running her fingers over the tooled leather. "That's very thoughtful, but I don't have a horse. The bay mare, Penny, is gentle as they come. You're welcome to ride her whenever you like." He cleared his throat. "Might make it easier to get around the property." Freedom, that's what he was offering her. After weeks of feeling trapped by circumstance, the gesture nearly brought tears to her eyes. "Thank you, Kieran. I'd like that very much." His eyes crinkled at the corners, not quite a smile, but close. "I'll saddle her for you tomorrow morning, show you the best trails." True to his word, the next day Kieran helped Wilhelmina mount the gentle bay mare. The side saddle felt strange after years of not riding, but her body remembered the posture. "There's a nice spot by the creek about a mile east," Kieran said, mounting his own horse. "Thought we'd start there." As they rode side by side through the ranch property, Wilhelmina felt something loosen in her chest. The breeze in her hair, the rhythm of the horse beneath her, simple pleasures she'd forgotten in the midst of grief and hardship. "How long have you had this ranch?" she asked, breaking the comfortable silence. "Bought the first 50 acres when I was 23, he replied. "Just after the war." "Added to it over time. You fought in the war between the states," he nodded. "Union cavalry, came west afterward like a lot of men who didn't have much to go home to." "Were you from the North originally?" "Boston," he said. "Irish parents, father worked the docks, mother took in washing." "Neither lived to see the war." "I'm sorry," she said, understanding loss all too well. They reached a bend in the creek where a cluster of cottonwoods created a shady haven. Kieran dismounted and helped Wilhelmina down, his hands strong and steady at her waist. "This is my thinking spot," he admitted, gesturing to a flat boulder beside the water. "Come here when the house feels too empty or decisions need making." Wilhelmina settled on the rock, watching the clear water ripple over stones. "It's peaceful." "That it is." He sat beside her, leaving a respectful distance between them. "You're doing well with the cooking and such. Men haven't eaten this good in years." "It's the least I can do," she said. "You've been very kind considering the circumstances." Kieran plucked a stem of grass, twirling it between his fingers. "Been meaning to ask, what do you plan to do when your 6 months are up?" The question caught her off guard. She'd been so focused on surviving each day that she hadn't thought beyond her contract. "I don't know," she admitted. "The homestead's gone. I have no family. Perhaps I could find work in town, though opportunities for women are limited." He nodded, eyes on the creek. You could stay on. As an employee, I mean, paid wages, your own room, the arrangement seems to be working well enough. Warmth bloomed in her chest at the offer, unexpected as it was. That's generous of you, not generosity. Good help is hard to find, but something in his voice belied the practical explanation. Over the next several weeks, Wilhelmina found herself settling into life at Silver Creek Ranch with surprising ease. Her rides on Penny became a daily pleasure. Sometimes Kieran would accompany her, pointing out landmarks or sharing stories of the early days on the ranch. Other times she'd ride alone, relishing the solitude and freedom. She also developed a routine with Bessie and the other dairy cows, finding comfort in the familiar task of milking. With Kieran's permission, she began making cheese and butter to sell in town, adding a small income of her own to supplement the arrangement. As spring gave way to early summer, the days grew longer and hotter. Wilhelmina often found herself watching Kieran as he worked with the cattle or mended fences, his movements efficient and purposeful. Sometimes he would look up, as if sensing her gaze, and their eyes would meet briefly before she turned away, a flush warming her cheeks. One evening in late June, a violent thunderstorm rolled in from the mountains. Wilhelmina was alone in the house. Frank and Thomas had gone to town, and Kieran was checking on a pregnant heifer in the north pasture. As thunder crashed overhead and rain lashed against the windows, she worried about him out in such weather. The door burst open just as she was lighting additional lamps. Kieran stood in the doorway, drenched to the skin, water streaming from his hat and coat. Goodness. She hurried to take his sodden hat. You're soaked through. Get those wet things off before you catch your death. He shrugged out of his coat, revealing a shirt that clung to his broad shoulders. Storm came up faster than I expected, had to help the heifer, she was having trouble. Is she all right? Wilhelmina fetched a towel from the kitchen. Mother and calf both fine. He took the towel, their fingers brushing. Thanks. There's stew keeping warm on the stove. Go change and I'll have it ready when you return. He nodded and disappeared down the hallway. When he returned, dressed in dry clothes, his hair was still damp and curling slightly at the nape of his neck. Something about the sight made Wilhelmina's heart beat faster. They ate by lamplight as rain drummed on the roof, creating an intimate atmosphere that felt both comfortable and charged with unspoken awareness. After they'd finished, Kieran helped clear the table, something he'd never done before. Where did you learn to cook like this? He asked as she washed the dishes. She smiled, pleased by the compliment. My mother taught me. She believed a woman should know how to make something from nothing, especially on the frontier. She was right. He leaned against the counter, watching her work. My mother was the same. Used to say a hot meal and a clean hearth could make a home out of any four walls. Wise woman. Wilhelmina handed him a plate to dry. Do you miss Boston? He considered the question. Sometimes, miss the ocean, mostly. The smell of salt air, the endless horizon. I've never seen the ocean. No, it's something else, like the sky and the earth meeting in a great blue expanse. His voice softened with memory. Terrifying and beautiful all at once. You make it sound wonderful. It is. He set down the dried plate. Maybe you'll see it someday. The simple statement, laden with possibility, hung in the air between them. Wilhelmina became acutely aware of how close they stood, of the way the lamplight caught the silver threads in his dark hair. Thunder boomed overhead, making her jump. Kieran's hand steadied her elbow, his touch warm through the fabric of her sleeve. Just thunder, he said softly, but he didn't release her. Wilhelmina looked up into his face, seeing emotions there she'd glimpsed only fleetingly before: concern, affection, and something deeper that made her breath catch. Kieran, she began, but was interrupted by the sound of hooves and voices outside. He stepped back, the moment broken. That'll be Frank and Thomas, caught in the storm like me. The next morning, Wilhelmina woke to brilliant sunshine and a world washed clean by the storm. As she prepared breakfast, she couldn't help replaying the previous evening in her mind. Something had changed between her and Kieran, a shift as subtle as it was significant. The men ate quickly and headed out to assess any damage from the storm. Only Kieran lingered, finishing his coffee as Wilhelmina needed dough for the day's bread. "Thought I'd ride into town today," he said. "Need anything?" she considered. "Thread if you're passing the mercantile, blue if they have it, and perhaps some cinnamon for baking," he nodded. "Consider it done." He stood, reaching for his hat. "Might be back late, don't hold supper." After he'd gone, Wilhelmina went about her usual tasks, but her thoughts kept returning to the man who'd purchased her contract. In the nearly 3 months she'd been at Silver Creek, Kieran Walsh had proved himself to be honorable, fair, and unexpectedly kind. He'd given her back her dignity when he could have treated her as little more than a servant. And somewhere along the way, her gratitude had deepened into something more complex, feelings she scarcely dared examine too closely. Late that afternoon, as she was gathering eggs from the chicken coop, she heard approaching riders. Looking up, she saw not only Kieran returning but also a wagon following behind him. Her curiosity piqued, she set down her basket and walked to meet them. Kieran dismounted with a nod of greeting. "Mrs. Vance, got a surprise for you." The wagon pulled up, driven by a middle-aged man Wilhelmina didn't recognize. In the back was a beautiful upright piano, its wood gleaming in the sunlight. "A piano," she gasped. "Whatever for?" "Noticed sheet music in your trunk when we brought it over," Kieran said. "Figured you must play." Tears pricked her eyes. She did play, had loved playing since childhood. The small piano in her parents' home had been her solace through many difficult times. When she married Daniel, leaving it behind had been one of her greatest sorrows. "It's too much," she whispered. Kieran shook his head. "Been sitting unused in the back of Weaver's Mercantile for years. His wife used to play, but her arthritis got too bad, made him a fair offer." "But still, Ranch House needs some civilizing influence," he said gruffly. "Besides, evenings get long in winter." With help from Frank and Thomas, the piano was installed in the main room. Once the men had gone back to their chores, Wilhelmina sat on the bench, running her fingers reverently over the keys. The instrument needed tuning but was otherwise in good condition. She began to play tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. A simple hymn gave way to a folk melody her mother had taught her. So absorbed was she in the music that she didn't notice Kieran standing in the doorway until she finished. "Beautiful," he said quietly. She wasn't sure if he meant the music or something else, but the way he looked at her made her cheeks warm. "Thank you for this gift," she said. "I can't tell you what it means to me." He moved into the room, coming to stand beside the piano. "My wife used to sing." Not professionally or anything, but she had a sweet voice. House has been too quiet since she passed. It was the first time he'd spoken of his late wife beyond the bare fact of her existence. Wilhelmina's heart ached for the loss she heard in his voice. "What was her name?" she asked gently. "Sarah." His expression softened with memory. "Married her right before I went off to war. She waited for me, even when reports came that I'd been killed at Gettysburg. She sounds like a remarkable woman." She was. He touched the piano, his fingers brushing the polished wood. "Would have liked to hear you play." The intimacy of the moment wrapped around them like a blanket. Wilhelmina played another melody, this one slow and tender. When she glanced up, Kieran's eyes were closed, his expression peaceful. In the weeks that followed, music became a regular part of evenings at Silver Creek Ranch. After supper was cleared away, Wilhelmina would play while the men listened, sometimes singing along to familiar tunes. Even Frank, usually taciturn, revealed a surprisingly good baritone voice. July brought scorching heat and the start of the summer cattle drive. Kieran and his men would be gone for 2 weeks, taking a small herd to the railhead at Tucson. The night before their departure, tension hung in the air during the evening meal. "Mrs. Cooper from the next ranch over will check on you every few days," Kieran told Wilhelmina as she served apple pie. "And Jackson from the general store said he'd stop by if he's making deliveries this way." "I'll be fine," she assured him. "I managed a homestead on my own after Daniel died." I can certainly handle the ranch house for 2 weeks. He nodded, but concern lingered in his eyes. Just the same, keep the shotgun by your bed, and if you hear anything suspicious, I'll fire a warning shot and hide in the root cellar, she finished, having heard the instructions twice already. Truly, Kieran, don't worry about me. Focus on getting those cattle to market safely. Later, after Frank and Thomas had turned in, Kieran lingered in the main room. Wilhelmina was knitting by lamplight, a shawl taking shape beneath her nimble fingers. There's something I need to tell you, he said abruptly. Been meaning to for a while. She set down her knitting. What is it? He sat in the chair opposite hers, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. When I bought your contract at that auction, I didn't tell you the whole truth about why. A knot of apprehension formed in her stomach. Oh, I knew your husband, Daniel, not well, but we'd done business a few times. Good man, fair. Kieran's gaze was steady. About a year before he died, he came to me for a loan, said he needed money for seed and supplies. Bad harvest the year before. Wilhelmina stared at him, her mind racing. Daniel had never mentioned borrowing money from Kieran Walsh. I lent him the money, Kieran continued. $500. He was supposed to repay it after the next harvest, but then the fever took him. I had no idea, she whispered. There was nothing in his papers about a debt to you. No, there wouldn't be. We shook hands on it, that's all. He ran a hand through his hair. When I heard about the auction that they were selling off your belongings to cover debts, I knew what was happening. Your husband's other creditors were circling, understanding dawned. So you bought my contract to recover your loan. I'm working off Daniel's debt to you, Kieran shook his head. No, that's not it at all. I considered the debt forgiven when Daniel died. I bought your contract because I couldn't stand to see Jacob Miller get his hands on you. Man's got a reputation for mistreating women who work for him. Relief flooded through her, followed by renewed confusion. But why tell me this now? Because your contract's half over and I've been thinking about what happens next. He met her eyes directly. I don't want you to feel obligated to stay on because of some perceived debt. When your 6 months are up, you're free to go wherever you choose. Or to stay if that's what you want. The implication in his words sent her heart racing. And what is it you want, Kieran? The question hung between them, laden with meaning. I want, he stopped, seeming to struggle with words. I want you to be happy, Wilhelmina, here or elsewhere. It was the first time he'd used her given name. The sound of it in his deep voice made something flutter in her chest. I am happy here, she said softly. Happier than I thought I could be after Daniel died. Relief crossed his features. Good, that's good. He stood, a bit awkwardly. Should turn in. Early start tomorrow. Kieran, she called as he reached the doorway. Be careful on the drive, he nodded once. Always am. The 2 weeks of the cattle drive passed more slowly than Wilhelmina had anticipated. She kept busy with her usual tasks, spent time with Bessie and the other animals, and played the piano in the evenings. But the house felt empty without Kieran's presence, and she found herself watching the road for signs of the men's return, Mrs. Cooper visited twice, bringing gossip and a jar of preserves. She was a kindly woman in her 50s whose own husband was also on a cattle drive. How are you settling in at Walsh's place? She asked during her second visit. He's a good man, but keeps to himself mostly. Been that way since his wife passed. He's been very kind to me, Wilhelmina replied, pouring tea. Mrs. Cooper studied her over the rim of her cup. Kind, is it? The way he looks at you when he thinks no one's watching goes beyond kindness, if you ask me. Heat rose in Wilhelmina's cheeks. I'm sure I don't know what you mean. Of course you don't, dear. Mrs. Cooper's smile was knowing. Just like you haven't been watching the road every 5 minutes since I arrived. Before Wilhelmina could respond, the sound of approaching horses reached them. She was on her feet in an instant, moving to the window. Well now, Mrs. Cooper chuckled, if that isn't proof, I don't know what is. Kieran and his men rode into the yard, dust-covered and weary-looking but intact. Relief washed over Wilhelmina, so palpable she had to grip the windowsill to steady herself. I should start supper, she said, trying to sound casual. They'll be hungry after the trail. Mrs. Cooper rose, gathering her shawl. I'll leave you to your reunion. But Wilhelmina. Her expression grew serious. Life's too short to waste time, especially out here. If there's something worth having, don't wait too long to reach for it. With that cryptic advice, the older woman took her leave, passing Kieran on the porch with a friendly greeting. He entered the house, removing his hat, his face breaking into a rare, full smile when he saw Wilhelmina. "Everything all right while we were gone?" he asked. She nodded, drinking in the sight of him tan darker from 2 weeks under the sun, leaner from trail rations, but whole and safe. "Everything was fine. How was the drive?" "Successful. Got a good price for the cattle." He set his hat on its peg. "Missed your cooking, though. Trail coffee's a poor substitute for yours." "Just my cooking." The words slipped out before she could stop them. His eyes met hers, darkening slightly. "No, not just your cooking." The admission, simple as it was, changed something between them. Over supper, as Kieran and the men shared stories from the trail, Wilhelmina was acutely aware of every glance, every accidental touch as dishes were passed. After the meal, Frank and Thomas headed to the bunkhouse, exhausted from the long journey home. Kieran remained, helping Wilhelmina clear the table, a task that had somehow become their private ritual. "Got something for you from Tucson," he said, reaching into his pocket. He produced a small package wrapped in brown paper. Wilhelmina untied the string, unwrapping the gift to reveal a beautiful silver hairpin adorned with a small turquoise stone. "It's lovely," she breathed, touching the stone with one finger. "Reminded me of your eyes," he said, then looked embarrassed at the admission. "Thought it might be useful with your hair always falling in your face when you work." She hadn't realized he'd noticed such a detail. "Thank you. It's the most beautiful thing I've owned in a long time." Impulsively, she leaned up and pressed a kiss to his cheek. His skin was warm beneath her lips, rough with stubble. When she pulled back, his expression was stunned, his eyes dark with emotion. For a moment, she thought he might pull her close, might finally cross the invisible boundary that had existed between them since her arrival. Instead, he cleared his throat and took a step back. "Should probably turn in," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "Been a long ride." Disappointment flashed through her. "Of course. Good night, Kieran." "Good night, Wilhelmina." August brought relentless heat that baked the land and tested everyone's patience. The cattle grew listless, seeking shade wherever they could find it. Even the creek ran lower, though it never dried up completely, a blessing in such conditions. One particularly brutal afternoon, Wilhelmina was returning from gathering wildflowers when she spotted Kieran by the small barn where the dairy cows were kept. He was shirtless, his bronzed skin gleaming with sweat as he worked on the roof, replacing shingles damaged in the recent storm. The sight of him muscles flexing with each swing of the hammer made her pause in the shade of a cottonwood. She shouldn't stare, she knew, but couldn't seem to tear her eyes away. In the nearly 5 months she'd been at Silver Creek, she'd come to admire not just Kieran's kindness and integrity, but also the physical strength that allowed him to work from dawn till dusk without complaint. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up, raising a hand in greeting. Caught, Wilhelmina had no choice but to approach. "Fixing the leak," she called, shielding her eyes from the sun. He nodded, setting down his hammer. "Should have done it after the storm, but the drive took priority." He climbed down the ladder, reaching for a canteen. "Those for the house?" he asked, gesturing to her flowers. "Yes, thought they might brighten the table." He took a long drink from the canteen, then offered it to her. Wilhelmina hesitated only briefly before accepting it. The water was warm but welcome, and the knowledge that his lips had touched the same spot sent an unexpected thrill through her. "Too hot to be out gathering flowers," he chided gently, taking back the canteen. "Sun like this can be dangerous." "Says the man working shirtless on a roof at midday," she countered, surprising herself with the teasing tone. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Fair point, but I'm used to it." "Well, I'm used to hard work myself. Besides, I wanted to make the house nice. Mrs. Cooper mentioned she and her husband might stop by tomorrow on their way back from town." "Did she now?" Something in his tone made her look at him more closely. Is that a problem? He shook his head. No problem, just curious why she's suddenly so interested in visiting. Never used to come by much before you arrived. Wilhelmina thought of Mrs. Cooper's knowing looks and matchmaking hints. I think she's lonely. Her children are all grown and gone. He didn't look convinced. Well, I'd better get back to this roof before the afternoon thunderstorms roll in. As predicted, clouds began building by late afternoon, promising relief from the heat. Wilhelmina was in the kitchen preparing supper when she heard the first distant rumble of thunder. Moments later, Kieran entered, his shirt back on but still damp with sweat. Roof's finished, he announced. Just in time from the sound of it. Good timing, she agreed. Supper will be ready soon. I made that apple cobbler you like. His eyebrows rose. What's the occasion? Does there need to be one? She stirred the pot of stew simmering on the stove. Perhaps I simply wanted to do something nice. For me, the direct question caught her off guard. She looked up to find him watching her intently, his expression open in a way it rarely was. Yes, for you, she admitted. Is that so surprising? He moved closer, close enough that she could smell the clean sweat and leather scent of him. Maybe not surprising, but worth acknowledging. Outside, thunder boomed closer and the first heavy drops of rain began to fall. Inside, a different kind of storm was brewing between them, Wilhelmina. His voice was low, intimate in the kitchen's warm confines. I've been thinking about what happens when your contract ends next month, her heart stuttered. Have you? He nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. I've gotten used to having you here, more than used to it. I've gotten used to being here, she whispered. I don't want you to leave. The admission seemed torn from him, but I don't want you to stay out of obligation either. What do you want, Kieran? She asked the same question she'd posed the night before the cattle drive, but this time she stepped closer, close enough that the fabric of her skirt brushed against his legs. His hand came up to touch her cheek, calloused fingers gentle against her skin. I want you, here, with me. He swallowed hard. As my wife, if you'd consider it. Joy burst through her like sunshine through clouds. Are you proposing to me, Kieran Walsh, doing a poor job of it, apparently? A rueful smile curved his lips. Should have rehearsed. She laughed, the sound bubbling up from a place of pure happiness. I don't need rehearsed words, just honest ones. Then, honestly. I think I've been falling in love with you since that day at the auction block, when you stood beside your cow with your chin up, refusing to be broken by circumstance. Tears pricked her eyes. And I think I've been falling in love with you since you brought my belongings back and promised I'd never go hungry at your table. His other hand came up to frame her face. Is that a yes, then? In answer, she rose on tiptoes and pressed her lips to his. For a moment, he seemed too stunned to respond. Then, with a groan, he pulled her against him, deepening the kiss. His mouth was warm and sure against hers, awakening sensations Wilhelmina had thought long buried. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, rain was lashing against the windows and thunder rolled overhead. But neither of them noticed the storm outside, lost as they were in the one between them. That's definitely a yes, she whispered against his lips. They were married 2 weeks later in Georgetown's small church, with Frank and Thomas as witnesses and Mrs. Cooper beaming in the front pew. Wilhelmina wore a new dress of sky blue calico, a wedding gift from Kieran with the silver and turquoise pin securing her carefully arranged hair. The ceremony was brief but meaningful, the pastor's words about partnership and endurance particularly resonant for a couple who had found each other after experiencing such profound losses. I now pronounce you man and wife, the pastor concluded. You may kiss your bride, Mr. Walsh. Kieran's kiss was gentle but carried a promise of passion to come. When they turned to face the small gathering, Wilhelmina's heart felt too full for her chest, joy threatening to spill over in tears. They hosted a small celebration at Silver Creek afterward, nothing elaborate. But there was music, Wilhelmina playing the piano with Mrs. Cooper singing, dancing in the yard as the sun set, and more food than the small group could possibly consume. As evening deepened into night and the guests began to leave, Kieran found his new wife sitting on the porch, watching the first stars appear. "Happy?" he asked, settling beside her. She leaned against his shoulder, contentment washing through her. "Completely, are you?" "More than I thought possible after Sarah died." He took her hand, his thumb caressing her knuckles. "Felt guilty at first, thinking of another woman, but Sarah wouldn't have wanted me to be alone forever." "No, she wouldn't have. Just as Daniel wouldn't have wanted that for me." She turned to face him. "We honor them by finding happiness again, don't you think?" "I do." He kissed her softly, then stood, pulling her to her feet. "Come on, Mrs. Walsh, I think it's time we retired." The newlywed months that followed were a time of adjustment and deepening bonds. Wilhelmina learned that her husband was a passionate man beneath his reserved exterior. Kieran discovered that his wife had an unexpected playful streak and a determination that matched his own. They worked side by side to prepare the ranch for winter, putting up preserves from the garden, smoking meat, and ensuring the livestock had adequate shelter. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, sometimes reading, sometimes talking, sometimes simply enjoying the comfort of each other's presence. One night in early November, as the first real cold snap settled over the land, Wilhelmina sat at her piano, picking out a lullaby her mother had sung to her as a child. Kieran, watching from his chair by the fire, noticed the wistful expression on her face. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. She smiled, her fingers still moving over the keys. "Children, I was wondering what it would be like to sing this to our own someday." Kieran set aside the book he'd been reading. "Is that something you want, children?" "Yes, I always did. Daniel and I tried, but—" She let the sentence trail off. "What about you? Do you want children?" "Never really thought about it with Sarah. We were too young and then the war happened." He moved to sit beside her on the piano bench. "But with you?" "Yes, I'd like to see little ones running around this place. Daughters with your eyes, maybe sons with your kindness." She leaned against him, the music forgotten. "I'd like that too." That night, their lovemaking held a new dimension, not just passion and comfort, but also hope for the future they were building together. December brought snow to the high country and festive preparations to Silver Creek Ranch. Wilhelmina decorated the house with pine boughs and red ribbons, determined to make their first Christmas together special. Kieran, initially bemused by her enthusiasm, found himself drawn into the spirit of the season, even riding all the way to Tucson to find gifts worthy of his bride. On Christmas Eve, after a dinner that featured Wilhelmina's mother's special recipe for roast goose, they exchanged presents by the fire. Kieran gave her a beautiful leather-bound journal and a gold locket containing miniature portraits of them, both commissioned during his Tucson trip. Wilhelmina's gift to him was a handsome new saddle blanket she'd woven herself, the pattern incorporating the Silver Creek brand and their intertwined initials. But she had another gift, one she'd been saving for the perfect moment. "There's something else," she said, taking his hand and placing it against her still flat stomach. "Something we made together." His eyes widened, understanding dawning. "You're with child," she nodded, tears of joy glistening. "Due in early summer, the doctor thinks." Kieran gathered her into his arms, holding her as if she were made of the most precious glass. "A baby," he whispered against her hair. "Our baby. Are you happy about it?" He pulled back to look at her, his eyes suspiciously bright. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it, Wilhelmina. I never thought I'd have this, a wife I adore, a child on the way, a true family of my own." The months of Wilhelmina's pregnancy passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. Kieran proved to be an attentive husband, insisting she rest more and hiring a local girl to help with the heaviest household chores. Wilhelmina accepted his concern with good grace, though she drew the line when he suggested she stop riding Penny. "I'll ride until I can no longer see the saddle over my belly," she declared. "The doctor said moderate exercise is good for both me and the baby." Kieran knew better than to argue when that particular tone entered his wife's voice. Instead, he made sure Penny was especially well-groomed and gentle, riding alongside Wilhelmina whenever his duties allowed. As spring returned to Silver Creek, Wilhelmina's body blossomed with new life. Kieran found her more beautiful than ever, the swell of her belly and the glow in her cheeks stirring a protective tenderness he'd never known he possessed. "I never thanked you properly," she said one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "For what?" he asked, puzzled. "For that day at the auction, for buying my contract when you could have simply written off the debt Daniel owed you." She took his hand, placing it on her rounded belly where their child kicked vigorously. "If not for that day, we wouldn't be here now waiting for this little one." Kieran smiled, feeling the strong movements beneath his palm. "I think we would have found each other somehow. Some things are just meant to be." "Why, Kieran Walsh," she teased, "I never took you for a romantic." "Only with you," he admitted. "Only ever with you." On a hot day in early July, 1 year after Wilhelmina had first arrived at Silver Creek Ranch, their son was born. After 18 hours of labor that left Kieran pacing the porch like a caged mountain lion, the midwife finally emerged with news of a healthy baby boy. When he entered the bedroom, Kieran found his exhausted but radiant wife cradling a tiny bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. "Come meet your son," she said softly. Kieran approached the bed with reverence, gazing down at the small, red face of his child. Dark hair like his own covered the baby's head, but when the infant opened his eyes briefly, they were the same changeable blue-green as his mother's. "He's perfect," Kieran whispered, gently touching the baby's cheek. "What shall we call him?" They had discussed names but hadn't settled on one. Now, looking at the child who represented both their past losses and future hopes, Wilhelmina knew. "Daniel Kieran Walsh," she said. "To honor the past while celebrating our future." Tears filled Kieran's eyes, the first his wife had ever seen from him. "It's a good name, a strong name." He leaned down to kiss her, then carefully took his son into his arms. As he held the tiny boy against his chest, a feeling of completeness washed over him. From the lowest point of his life, losing Sarah to the fever, he had somehow found his way to this moment of perfect joy. "Welcome to Silver Creek Ranch, Daniel Kieran," he murmured to his son. "You'll never go hungry here. That I promise you, just like I promised your mother." 5 years later, Wilhelmina stood on the porch of Silver Creek Ranch, watching as Kieran taught their son to ride his very first pony. Little Daniel, called Danny by everyone, sat proudly on the gentle animal, his father's hand steady on the lead rope. "Look, Mama, I'm riding like Papa," the boy called, waving enthusiastically. "I see you, sweetheart," she called back. "You're doing wonderfully." Beside her in a cradle, their 10-month-old daughter, Sarah Elizabeth, cooed and reached for the rattle Wilhelmina offered. The little girl had her mother's auburn hair but her father's storm-gray eyes, a perfect blend of them both. As she watched her family, Wilhelmina's mind drifted back to that terrible day at the auction block in Georgetown. How hopeless she had felt, standing beside Bessie, who now contentedly grazed in the pasture with her own calves facing a future of servitude and hardship. Instead, fate in the form of a taciturn rancher with hidden depths had given her a second chance at happiness. A chance to love again, to build a family, to create a home filled with music and laughter and the simple joys of daily life. What are you thinking about with that smile on your face? Kieran's voice broke into her reverie. He had left Danny safely ensconced on the pony's back, now held steady by Frank, who had become like an uncle to the children. "Just how far we've come," she replied, leaning into his embrace as he joined her on the porch. "From that day with the cow to this." He chuckled, the sound rumbling through his chest against her cheek. "Best $70 I ever spent." "Such a romantic," she teased, tilting her face up for his kiss. "Only with you," he murmured against her lips. "Only ever with you." As the sun began to set over Silver Creek Ranch, painting the sky in the same colors as the evening of their first kiss, Wilhelmina Walsh knew with absolute certainty that she had found her true home not in a place, but in the arms of the man who had promised she would never go hungry. and who had kept that promise in ways neither of them could have imagined.